Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, podcast listeners of all ages and stages, welcome, bienvenue, to episode 84 of the Jolly Thoughts podcast. You are in for a Jim Dandy of a conversation here, whatever you happen to be listening. This is a conversation with a classicist, Dr. Nadya Williams. She's a classicist doesn't mean she's a classist. She's not looking down on us. To the contrary, a very humble person. She's somebody who spends time with the classics. And again, that doesn't just mean books that are really great. Like, I think that the first couple of seasons of The Simpsons are, for example, classics. Specifically referring to content from the classical period. So kind of ancient Greece and Rome. The seedbeds from which Christianity, or in which rather, maybe Christianity grew. And so she actually came to faith after her studies, which is interesting. And we'll hear about that a little bit more in the conversation. But uniquely poised she is to be able to kind of speak to some of the issues of cultural Christianity and how those things connected, which is, of course, the title of the book that we dig into the most. You'll hear about that as we go here, but Cultural Christians in the Early Church. I couldn't get enough of this conversation. I wish I would have had, the ability to ask the other 95 questions that I had listed before we actually got together. But Nadya was very gracious and generous with her time, and also gracious to put up with some of the malformed questions that I threw her away, and some of the off-the-cuff ones. A lot of hot-button issues in here, so make sure you have gloves to handle this one. In the background, picture of my son, a bunch of pictures of my son because he's about to turn 13. So if you go look even further up here, I think it says happy birthday. So about to have a teenager in my house. Therefore, if you're a listener of this podcast, please pray for me.
I was born in the Soviet Union when there was such a place. And in 1991, right before the Soviet Union collapsed, my family moved to Israel. So I grew up in a secular Jewish home. Then my dad got a job in the U.S. when I was in high school. So we moved to the U.S. and it was supposed to be for a year, but that was like 30 years ago almost. So I guess it stuck. So I'm a dual citizen of Israel and the United States. And I pursued a PhD in classics. And then soon after that, I came to Christ. That's kind of the short story.
So soon after, kind of post, like in graduate?
Post-PhD. No, post-grad school.
Post-grad school came to Christ?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So it was like 3 years later.
And so was that and to the degree you're comfortable talking about it, was that a pretty radical conversion?
Oh,
was
yeah.
That kind of okay.
Very. Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Any more detail you want to share? I mean, like, was it, what made somebody who had that background say, oh, Jesus, it's probably Jesus?
Well, we talk about paradigm shifts, right? Like people need a paradigm shift to make that sort of radical conversion. And in my case, I grew up in a home where the gospel was the gospel of education. If you get straight A's, if you get only hundreds on all of your tests and all of that, it will go well with you. And at age 30, right as I got a tenure track job and my academic career seemed secure and flourishing, I had a year of just personal crisis that showed that this gospel was not correct. And so that opened my eyes to searching, like, what is there? Like, what is the meaning of life?
And then Jesus. Okay. Well, hey,
yeah.
Amazing. That's amazing. So obviously, in some respects, you are uniquely poised to write the kinds of books that you've written. So we got a couple newer ones that are kind of out there. We've got one that I think is even just maybe it's just released not that long ago, which is the idea of Christians reading classics. I think
that's actually coming in November.
Oh, okay. Coming out soon. Christians reading classics.
Yes.
So as somebody who is a Christian who reads classics, that sounds like something that you'd be, well poised. Oh, yeah. You also have, maybe this one's the most recent one, then Mothers, Children, and the Body Politic.
Yes.
That came out relatively recently. What's the elevator pitch on that one?
Our society wants to price motherhood and children, and whenever you just kind of weigh the economic costs, it seems like children are just too much. Like, how about you stick to your career and get a puppy? And my point is, this is very much a post-Christian view of viewing not just women and children and family life, but also just pricing human life. And in the age of AI, of course, like whenever you weigh the benefits, it seems like artificial intelligence is so much more effective and efficient than humans who are so weak and need rest and need financial resources from our government and everybody else, and need time. They're just needy. People are needy. And so my point is, if you look back at how Christ viewed people and how early Christianity viewed people, if we look at the crux of it all, it's the idea of the Imago Dei, that every single one of us is made in God's image and therefore is unconditionally precious.
Wow. Okay. Well, that sounds stirring.
Yeah.
And that's all bonus, because really what we're here to talk about today is this dynamite book, Cultural Christians in the Early Church, a historical and practical introduction to Christians in the Greco-Roman world. And so it's funny, if anybody can see the cover, it's actually like it looks like a kind of a chariot. People would ride around, and on the bottom has a license plate. It says Rome, WWJD. And so it's, I don't know who came up with that idea, but that's funny.
Zondervan.
Zondervan,
You
that's
know,
right.
book cover like artists are just the best people.
That's what they get the big bucks for.
Yes.
Or the medium bucks for.
Probably.
That's right. So yeah, the idea, as I kind of understand, you kind of lay it out here near the introduction of the book. You say the shocking argument of this book is that cultural Christians could exist and even flourish in a world in which Christianity was a persecuted minority. Cultural Christianity sometimes, I mean, some people might be kind of like familiar with that right off the bat. Some people might not be, but sometimes we maybe just think of that as kind of like a lukewarm Christianity or a compromised Christianity, or like another fancier word would be like a syncretistic Christianity, where people take one thing and kind of put it the other. But you define it as the faith of those who are confessing Jesus with their words while living by the standards of the surrounding culture. So would it be fair to say, like, the idea is there has to be an culture? Like, we have to have something that's at the foundation, that's the base, and then we have these other kind of things. So you described yourself as a actually, you said you're born in the Soviet Union, then you grew up, at least for a large part, in Israel. Now you live in America. You have a hybrid identity, but at the bottom, there's some kind of identity that you have that sometimes has to trump your other identities, right? Sometimes that can kind of navigate back and forth. So the idea is, we think that Christians, at least I don't know if everybody thinks this, but it seems to be maybe the point is that Christians, their Christian identity should be that identity, the one ring to rule them all. If it's a terrible way to say that, but the idea that, like, if there's one thing they're going to choose, if they have to choose against their Canadianness or their Americanness to support their Christianness, that's what they will do. And I think a lot of us are comfortable with saying, well, I mean, we can see that happening all around us today, but nobody would ever think that would happen in the early church, because there was such a high cost to be a Christian, right? And that's the thing that's kind of like, when you read through this, you're like, is this real? Like, this is kind of mind-blowing. You lay out the book in 3 sections. You have arguments for what happens kind of post-Constantinian. Again, a lot of people, I think, could figure that out. Okay, yeah, when he makes it legal, and not just legal, but beneficial, we can start to see, well, that of course makes sense. But then you work further back and you start to show these seeds actually in the persecuted church and kind of the larger empire-wide persecutions. And you're like, ooh, that kind of stings. But you start with the New Testament itself and give us a number of examples. And so I'd love to hear, like, even just the first one where you talk about the idea of Ananias and Sapphira, that story in Acts. What's happening here with Barnabas? Because that part was something that completely blew my mind.
So one thing to keep in mind is we usually kind of assume that there's a conscious choice, right? When you think like somebody's a cultural Christian, like, well, they're making this choice. But what if they're not? To use another analogy, fish don't think about the water they swim in. And where we live, like our society, like you live in Canada, you don't think about it necessarily all day, every day, that like, here is my decision. Like, I'm having this for lunch because I'm a Canadian, or I'm going to do this activity because I'm a Canadian. Like, that's not how people operate. And that's my point with the early church. If you live in a very like powerful, dominant culture, the Roman Empire, that surrounds you, that governs your days, activities, has particular holidays, has particular way of thinking about pretty much everything, which is what happens in any culture. infiltrates your thinking without you consciously realizing it. And what happens with Christianity is that it offers something completely different, which means it is actually to choose the Christian way of thinking, say, about property or marriage and children and whatever else, that you have to really be countercultural and resist that dominant, resist the water you swim in, which is very difficult.
Yeah, I mean,
And that's the
fish.
problem. Yeah. So, like with Ananias and Sapphira, the reason I opened the book kind of with their example as the first cultural Christian is here are converts. Like they seem genuinely converted. They love Christ. They want to serve the church. But they also have very Roman ideas of thinking about property. So, for those who might not have read this story recently, what we have is a couple who sell off some property and they donate the money to the church. And they don't actually donate all of the proceeds that they made from the sale. And that's where the problem is, because it seems like they have made a vow before the sale that they would donate everything. And so they get struck dead. And it's this shocking thing, like for the church. And it's a shocking thing for the readers today. Like if you read that section in Acts, it's sort of like, what just happened?
Crazy.
And it raises really uncomfortable questions for all of us. But the point of it in this particular passage, what it shows is that they are very much trying to be Christians without giving up their Roman identity. So thinking about property as benefactors in both the Greek city-states and in the Roman Empire, there was this category of public benefactors, which means if you donate money to an organization, your temple, or whatever else, you expect public recognition. And that's what they wanted. They expect honor out of it. Honor is this big currency that the ancient world functioned on. But of course, the early church didn't. Jesus wasn't seeking honor and recognition and applause. And some of these early followers, like Ananias and Sapphira, didn't seem to recognize that.
Yeah. That is a wild. I mean, again, it's so jarring. I lead people through reading the Bible all the time, and they think that the New Testament is going to be all, hip hip hooray in contrast to the Old Testament, and all of a sudden they read this and like, whoa, what just happened? And so I don't know that the explanation that you've given necessarily lets us know why the consequence was death, but it certainly lets us know what's at least in the background as the problem. You also in the book just mentioned this thing about Barnabas, which to me was really, really fascinating. So I don't know if you want to kind of like let us know, because I mean, Barnabas is obviously held up as the example, but maybe he is also a symptom of not necessarily cultural Christianity, but cultural Judaism at the time.
Yeah, so he is a Levite, which is an interesting detail. Like for those who remember in the Old Testament, what were Levites? They were not supposed to own any property. But here he is donating a large chunk of cash to the church. And it's kind of like, what just happened? So why does a Levite suddenly have property? And he's not even from Israel. He hasn't been living locally for a while, as Acts tells us and giving us his background. But there's this beautiful restoration here, because by donating property to the church, he is kind of restored to his original state as a Levite, as somebody who was just meant to serve God and wasn't meant to be like a wealthy businessman making profits and whatever else. So we see this kind of restoration of the what was wrong for generations is now made right in Christ.
That's really good. It's really good. So we move on, and then we have this on page 29. We move on, starting to talk about food, but I think you call it barbecue and wine. In theory, you say, Paul notes that food is food. Hey, it's food. In reality, however, it has too many cultural associations that are likely to lead the eaters and others around them into sin. Then you go on later on to say, if all food is lawful, this is a way that I think that the Corinthians, I believe he's writing to the Corinthians, this is probably how they're thinking. If all food is lawful to consume for believers and no food may pollute them, then why should anything else that they do to their bodies pollute them? And then you go on again to say the Corinthian Christians' behavior at their celebrations of the Lord's Supper, as described by Paul, combine the worst features of some other words that we'll talk about. But I guess going back to, even before we go to the way that they celebrate the Eucharist, obviously a lot of preachers make hay on Corinthians, and we get to say like, good thing these guys were so screwed up, because we had these excellent letters that teach us how not to be. it does seem like there's a lot going on in the Corinthian church that we can kind of read between the lines. What is the association that you make there between food and sex for them?
So all of these things that the Corinthians are doing, we have to keep in mind that Corinth is a major Greek city-state. Now it's a Romanized Greek city-state by the time Paul is visiting it and writing to the Corinthians. But the point is they're very cultural.
Mhm.
So in both Greek and Roman culture, banqueting had particular associations. In the Greek world, for example, the symposium was an aristocratic institution. So wealthy men, and it's men only, gather for the symposium. And we have, for example, Plato's dialogue symposium, which is a highly stylized dinner party with conversation and all of that. And the whole point is it separates the really distinguished people from everybody else. Not everybody can join the symposium. Not everybody is welcome. Sorry. Like, you're just not invited if you are not one of the elect, if you will. Then with the Roman banqueting system, you have something that's a little bit more welcoming to everybody, but people are seated around the tables by order of rank, like social rank, but also political power if you have any, and so on. But what is really special and significant here about the Roman banqueting practice is that in the Roman banquet, you would be served food and drink appropriate to your status. So not everybody gets served the same food or wine. So when Paul is saying, like, some of you are eating like great meals at the Lord's Supper and some of you go home hungry, it's like, well, this is exactly proper Roman banqueting structure. So for a Roman to read something like this, it would be like, well, yeah, that's what we do. This reinforces the social structure. This is exactly how our gatherings are meant to be. Whereas Paul is saying, well, this is not how Christ meant the Lord's Supper to be. And this is where it is highly confusing for the Corinthians, because they sort of halfway understood part of the assignment. Because, for example, there were probably like enslaved people who were members of the Corinthian church who would not normally be invited to a Roman banquet. And yet they're invited here, except if you're not treating them fully as persons, then you're still not fulfilling quite the law. Oh, I'll stop here. You
No,
look
that's
like
good.
you have an
No,
idea.
that's great.
Yeah.
No, it's that's so fascinating. It's like if they kind of made it halfway. So
Yeah.
they brought them in, but they didn't actually elevate them, or I guess you could maybe say they didn't elevate them, or they didn't humble themselves. Right? There had to be some kind of leveling that happens around this table. That's the Greek, the Roman convivium. Is that the word? Ooh, that's a fun word.
Convivium, yes.
That'd be like with life together. What is convivium? I mean, that's probably
Yeah, it's
yeah.
I mean that's the idea, that you
Yeah.
are living together, or in a sort of like living it up together. So
Living it up together.
that's how you get the English word, for instance, conviviality, where we think of it. It's like, that's a really good party, a convivial party.
Right.
But again, for Romans, there had to be that element of everybody should know their place in society. I mean, you
Yeah.
have to keep in mind the ancient world was highly hierarchical. You
Sure.
were meant to know your place in society. Bad things happen in societies where people don't behave according to their status. But that's exactly what Jesus did, was completely like flip it all upside down.
Right. That's true. Um, so people had a great time at these parties. They were living it up. It was very convivial. Did they also do like naughty things at these parties? So like, yeah, yeah.
Well, so we hear stories, like, for example, from the imperial biographer Suetonius. Whenever emperors hosted a convivium, there was a little excessive living it up going on. But for the Corinthians, not necessarily. That would, at a typical like house party, you would not necessarily expect the really naughty stuff. But it was really readily available, which is why Paul has a lot to say on the subject.
Yeah, so that's connecting to, like, you kind of seem to make this point that if they're being told that the food that is sacrificed to idols at the end of the day is just food, and so it can't actually affect them, is there some kind of and how does this connect maybe with their cultural understanding? Is there some connection to, well, if food just kind of comes into the body and goes out of it and doesn't make me unclean, then other things that I do with my body also can't make me unclean. So, for example, having sex in inappropriate ways with inappropriate people at inappropriate times. Like, is there some kind of connection going on in the background for the Corinthians there?
I think so. And later on in the second century, the Gnostics will make a big deal out of this because some of the Gnostics took this to a whole another level in arguing that, like, yeah, our bodies don't matter at all. With the Corinthians, it seems like it's a little less systematic, but the whole idea of whatever is legal for the Romans, whatever is allowed for the Romans is surely fine for us. So if we're not having to follow Jewish practices with regard to food, why not with regard to other things? The cost of a prostitute would have been like the price of a lunch. So again, you have comparable costs, not something that is like a significant expense. So anybody could do this in Corinth, and such pastimes were readily available. You didn't have to work hard to find it. Rather, you had to work hard to avoid things like that. And that's exactly what Paul is saying. Like, you are different. You are meant to be different. But again, back to the analogy, fish swimming in the water. If the water you're swimming in looks like this, and everybody else is doing it. And that's kind of the danger for us today when we think about it with even with what is legal versus what is not. Like, just to say, well, this thing is legal doesn't mean it is necessarily a good idea for Christians. And an obvious, I'll mention it because it's in the news right now, and a lot of Christians are thinking about it, is medically assisted suicide. That's a pretty horrible thing. And you would say, like, well, it's legal. But should Christians say that this is a good thing just because the law allows it? Absolutely not.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Canada is well down the road on that, further ahead than I believe the
Yeah.
U.S. is in some respects.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I also think of like things like pornography and how
Oh, yeah.
people tend to think of that as being kind of disembodied, and therefore, like, it's not actually something that affects me as a person, and the other person on the other end isn't real. And it's completely legal for people of a certain age, right? As well as other kind of substances, which we
But
can.
see, but that's
Yeah.
like cultural Christianity right there. So as a Christian, when you're living in a culture that says all of these things are fine, and in fact, if the culture says some of these things are really good, how do you consciously resist and say, this is not what the gospel teaches?
Well, that's a good. So I was gonna push snooze on this till later, but rather let's just kind of flag it up now, because one of the first things I kind of noted down, when even after your definition of like, hey, this is what cultural Christianity is, um, if there is a cultural Christianity, it means that there has to be a Christianity that is somehow, for lack of a better word, a-cultural. Like, there has to be a meta Christianity that becomes enculturated in specific places in specific times. It does that, and this is outside of the role of a historian, but no doubt you have thoughts about it. Does that exist, for lack of a better word? Like, is there a way that we can have distilled out what that is, such that we can then know for certain what was being enculturated in AD 30 or whatever, in AD 70 in culture, and then say, okay, well, those specific things, they don't look the same today because our cultures are different, but some things are consistent, and some things, specifically those lifestyle kinds of things. Anyway, it's a bit of it may be a bomb, but even if you have a couple thoughts on it, it could be helpful. But
It's a wonderful theological question, and it's a reminder that theology and history for Christians are always intertwined. Really, there was only one perfect man to ever walk the earth, and Jesus is the only one who has fully lived everything that he taught, and did so without sin. We, however, have to struggle with sin, which is why we will never be perfect Christians, and our whole life here on earth is a process of sanctification. So that's my answer, is we can pursue it. But the whole point is, just because we're never going to achieve perfection in following Christ on this side of heaven doesn't mean that we should give up. And my point is, like, studying this history is a reminder. It's a humbling reminder that even the early Christians, whom we are so prone to idealize, falsely, as I argue, they were prone to the same sins that we are prone to. So in a way, I think this is good news, because it's a reminder that Christians always have have sin.
Hmm. One of the easiest things that I often tell people if they want to try to kind of remain connected to faith,
Hmm.
and it seems so easy, and yet it's actually quite difficult in our day and age, apparently, is to just regularly commit to gathered worship. Like, just come to church, go to church. You can't come. You
Absolutely.
can't come to
I
my
would
church.
agree.
That's fine. Go to another
Hmm.
church. I don't care. But find one, plug into it, go to church. In fact, I shared with you an article that's just been published by Religion News Service, at least published based upon when this is coming out here, or recorded on June 19th. It was about a survey of 24,000 different Christians across the U.S., and they found that something like 40+% of them are connected to multiple kind of congregations. I don't know what to do with that. I think that's a very interesting thing. But the other thing is that whether or not they're connected to multiple congregations, it doesn't mean that they're consistently coming to any congregation on a Sunday morning. Or, hey, if your church does Saturday night, I don't know. I'm not here to argue about that. But just the idea of regularly, weekly creating these rhythms of kind of gathering together with people. It seems like it's so important. On page 73, as we move past the New Testament era a little bit, you hint at this idea that I think it was in the year 111, there was an edict, in Bithynia. Okay. There's an edict in Bithynia where I think the governor was maybe trying to disrupt certain kind of groups. And so what he did was he made it illegal for large groups to gather. I don't know how large groups are, but it says that it had the effect that they were kind of looking for in some respects, is that it then caused people to disperse, whatever. I thought back to, I don't know, every regionality and governorship was different, but in our area back in 2020 and really kind of into 2021, we were quite aggressive. Our government was quite aggressive in how they could, and so there was a while where you were not allowed to meet with people outside your household, and then there was a while where you couldn't be in groups of over 10, et cetera, et cetera. And so even as I was reading this, I was like, oh, there's got to be an analogy here to this COVID-19 pandemic, which you also kind of you draw out as you go along here. At page 81, you say many others, once they were banned from gathering in large groups with fellow believers, they decided instead to forsake Christianity, and they went back to traditional Roman religion. Why? Well, perhaps because it was the easiest thing to do. The story shows that an empire-wide or systematic persecution was actually not necessary to gut a local church. I'd love to hear more, any of your kind of thoughts on how that whole thing kind of shook out for people.
Yeah. So many studies today show that one of the biggest disruptors that the pandemic brought to worship is that it simply disrupted habit, right? Like if you're out of the habit of doing something week in, week out, you simply find something else that you do during that time.
Mhm.
Although to go back to that RNS study that you mentioned, I actually have some theories for what might be going on, like
Yeah.
people who attend multiple churches.
Right.
Okay, I know a lot of people with kids in youth group age who have kids who go to youth group in another church in addition to or instead of the one at their church. So
Mhm.
that's one example. People with kids especially will seek out activities in addition to what their church offers. It's nothing bad. I mean, this is like the summer, for instance, is vacation Bible school season, and my kids this week are attending VBS at a different church. I mean, that's the point. Like everybody circulates, right?
Right.
Like if there are 4 different churches over the course of the next like 2 months in my area who are all holding VBS, the same kids will be at all the VBSs. So I
Right.
think that's a beautiful way for the body of Christ in a local kind of region to collaborate together. For my husband and me, like we're faithful members of a wonderful local congregation. We love our church. We also go to a Tuesday night prayer service that an Anglican deacon hosts at his house, and we love it. Like
Right.
we're not planning to switch churches. It's just that we love our friends in both our church and the friends with whom we gather every Tuesday night. I mean,
Right.
it's a precious, life-giving kind of thing. Sometimes we forget that any given congregation is just a portion of the body of Christ. So kind of this is a way for small c Catholic to gather together whenever you see things like that. So as long as people have a primary congregation where they're actively serving, plugging in and all that, I think this sort of trend is maybe something to applaud rather than worry excessively.
That's good. I actually wanted to ask you about this, and I didn't prime you on this. And so,
Mhm.
as I always,
Go for it.
I didn't tell you in advance, but always I'm like, hey, if we say something, if we ask a question,
Sure.
you're like, no, I don't want to talk about that. We can cut it out. But do you know whether or not this phenomena has any analog to the first century or the second century? Like what? Because I mean, sorry, a lot of people who, when they have concerns about this in today, is because, well, they would say, where are you rooted? So like, where is your, for lack of a better word, kind of spiritual community? And therefore, in some respects, you could say spiritual authority. That's maybe a secondary issue, but one that some people do kind of worry about in some respects. Like, if you, how are you submitting in some respects to the body if you're kind of in neither local body? What would that have looked like in the first century? Would they have had a church, or would have, you know what I mean? Like, could they have gone to quote unquote multiple churches? Is that even a thing?
So in areas where you have house churches, you probably have like smaller groups gathering together. But there is a sense that every city has just one church.
Hmm.
So presumably, at least sometimes everybody would have gathered together. So when Paul writes to the Corinthians, he is writing to just one Corinthian church,
Hmm.
uh, and assuming that all of them have a way of hearing his letter together.
Right.
So I think that's something to keep in mind, that you wouldn't have had the option that we have today where it's like, well, there are like 5 different churches within 2 miles of my house, and there are all sorts of options. Like that would not have been the case in the ancient world. If you go to a house church, you go to that house church because it's probably close by, and so on in your region of the city.
Hmm.
It's not necessarily that you're like church hopping in a modern sense. That option would not have existed in the ancient world. But it is interesting to think of somebody like Paul as a person who is of the church, but not like of any particular local church.
That's true. Yeah. I do wonder where his membership card would have lied.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I
Yeah.
think he would say it's with the body of Christ. And this
Right.
is again like bringing us to small c Catholic, that the whole church in the empire really is one church,
Right.
but you are a member of the local church. And even for Paul, whenever he's traveling, I think he would have seen himself for that given Sunday as a member of whatever local congregation he was worshiping with.
Right. That sounds beautiful, utopian, and all well and good until all of a sudden you start realizing that apparently people disagree on who is and who isn't within the small C Catholic Church. So we're kind of hopping
Yeah.
around a little bit here, but as
Mm.
things go along, I mean, I've heard of the Donatists before, but I only ever heard of them in respects to Saint Augustine, basically combating them and saying like, no, no, no. Even though the priest who baptized you um, at one point recanted or at one point turned over scriptures to the authorities, your baptism is still legitimate. You're still a Christian, whatever. That was the only thing I ever kind of knew about them. I didn't really think of them, frankly, as like a sect or even maybe a rival type of Christianity. But do you want to maybe kind of let us know some more about kind of that scenario and how you see kind of cultural? Because I mean, this is some of the weirdest and wackiest parts of the book for me is when you start talking about the way that their viewpoints might have contributed to like an aggressively kind of martyr based Christianity, and I would love to hear some more clarification there.
Yeah, so we're dealing with sectarian violence that arose in North Africa in the days of Augustine, because one particular group of Christians did not want to accept back people who had um, relented during persecution earlier on, and it it becomes this like big dividing point to the extent that even Constantine feels like he has to intervene. Uh, so what happened? What happened that caught the emperor's attention is specifically the violence of it all. So from the perspective of the emperor, like whatever disagreements you have, they're not really significant. But if it is uh, disturbing the peace of the empire, well, that's a problem. And that became a serious concern for local peace.
Mhm.
But what is interesting is that there is a long tradition of such violence going back in um, North African city-states, and that's what Augustine later on writes about. That
Mhm.
like the Donatists are only part of this long story,
Mhm.
where again, where that brings us back to culture,
Mhm.
where the local culture of violence has existed in these city-states for centuries and continues to exist long after Constantine, which is again why Augustine can observe it firsthand and say, like, how can you as Christians be so violent against each other? Uh, Constantine tries to solve it as a good, proper Roman bureaucrat, which is by issuing an edict, like everybody will behave and go to your proper corners and go for it. And it doesn't work, which
Shocking.
I know. Well, and I think it's a great example of a Constantine learning because things go much better with Nicaea, which this year is the 1700th anniversary. I think Constantine learns something from this particular episode, but it is a really striking example of how culture and misunderstanding culture leads to serious problems that are spiritual as much as political and everything else.
Yeah, they have this like crazy, like almost, I've never seen these movies, but almost like the Purge style thing that happens every once in a while. So is it like a couple days a year or something like that, where all of a sudden they kind of get split into teams, for lack of a better word, and instead of playing capture the flag, they hurt and stab each other and they go crazy?
That's not the Donatists. That's
Oh,
the other kind of purge that Augustine is complaining about. But
right.
it is all part of the same kind of culture.
That's right.
That yeah.
So that's the milieu in which the
Mhm.
Christianity that becomes
Yes,
Donatism that emerges from that.
exactly.
So the argument is they're kind of used to
They're used to it. Yeah.
violence, like the kind of
Yeah.
violence that for us to be like, oh my gosh, like calling the National
Yeah.
Guard,
Oh
like
yeah.
that kind of crazy violence is part of their actual kind of, not their DNA necessarily, but their
Mhm.
cultural DNA.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah. It's
yeah,
horrifying. And
that's crazy.
Augustine is horrified,
Right,
having
right.
been educated in Rome and this proper. It's funny because Augustine is one of those interesting cases because he is from North Africa originally, but he has spent a lot of his adult life away from it. So when he comes back and is converted and is looking at all of this with his like sort of urbanite Roman eyes, he is duly shocked.
Yeah, duly shocked. And then violence, also connects into, you mentioned the idea that there's a time where a bunch of Roman soldiers, I don't remember the details, I know it's on page 134, but there's a bunch of Roman soldiers, there's some kind of conflict about whether or not they should proclaim their allegiance, I believe, to the emperor, or whether they should not do so, and that's somehow because of it's a hinge point for their Christian faith, I think. But even if I'm wrong, you can tell me. But the point that you kind of ask, I think, is why are there even so many Christians that are in the Roman military anyway? Like, what is it about um, their beliefs or their preferences that seems to lend them towards that? So correct me where I went wrong there. I'm sure I went. Sure, it's just
Yeah,
yeah.
so no, this is fascinating because this is Diocletian's persecution. So one of the final kind of final attempts at persecution, and the Emperor Diocletian in 284, he focuses his persecution specifically on Christians in the Roman military because the military should be protecting the emperor, and the emperor is obviously very concerned about surviving. This is coming out of the third century crisis during which too many emperors were assassinated. So Diocletian's nervousness is very well justified. He wants soldiers who are loyal, which means he wants them to take oaths that they will fulfill. And therefore, the whole idea of swearing an oath of loyalty to the emperor, but suddenly realizing that these people may not actually feel that sort of loyalty to the oath that they're swearing by pagan gods, and so on. So um, ultimately, one question I have about all of this that I cannot answer based on the evidence that we have is, did these Christians enter the Roman Empire the Roman military as Christians,
Hmm.
or were they converted in the military? Because it's an interesting point that experiences living close to the edge, living close to like death, forces people to consider spiritual matters very seriously. And it does seem like the military in antiquity, just like today, was more prone to considering those religious questions. Um, we know various altars have been found in military camps across the Roman Empire. A lot of interest in Mithraism, um, but in the military today, soldiers are very likely to become more faithful when they're in the military.
Hmm.
So.
Right. So then, i- we won't. I mean, you're not an Anabaptist.
No.
Okay, yeah. So we won't necessarily say that it'd be an issue with them having joined the military,
Hmm.
if they were Christians. Although it does flag this issue of like, if they joined because they love violence, then that'd be something that would be like, oh, then why are you? How are you a Christian in
I
some
mean,
respects?
people
Yeah,
people in the Roman world joined the military, especially towards the later part of the empire, because of the perks. The
sure.
military offered a lot of good perks.
Right.
You could become a citizen
Yeah.
um, as a result of your service. You could get land. So if you are from a farming family and you are a younger son, you were not going to inherit property.
Right.
The
Yeah.
military was a good route to go.
Yeah.
But again, it raises the question, as a Christian, how would you have, with full conscience, joined if you knew that you would have to take this oath by the pagan gods?
Right. Yeah. Um, and so I don't know. I don't think this showed up in your book, but surely you came across it. There was also this point in time where um, certain wealthy Christians, um, rather than themselves offer the incense offering to Caesar, I think it would have been,
Mhm.
they would have sent their slaves to offer it on their behalf. Um, and then they felt like their hands were kind of clean because they didn't themselves offer it. It was kind of like, it was like by proxy. In some respects, this is how I think a lot of us tend to think about military service, as an analogy. Like, we're not the ones doing the stuff, the difficult stuff. It's other people who are on our behalf doing that, right? So they kind of firm those things out. Um, Alcohol. You mentioned on page 37 that there was a bit of a pendulum swing in terms of how Christians view alcohol. What did you mean by that?
So up until about 20, 25 years ago, uh, places like Wheaton College, for example, just did not allow students to drink at all, even if you were legally allowed to. So that legal point again, you could be over age 21, but if you're a Christian at particular colleges, you were not allowed to drink.
Mhm.
Um, and now it seems like drinking is very widely accepted.
Mhm.
And in some churches, it's kind of part of the culture that you might have church gatherings at a local pub or whatever else,
Mhm.
which again would have been pretty much unheard of. Um, so the
In
question
America, yeah.
is, yeah, in
Yeah, yeah.
America
That's
anyway.
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I guess that probably, I suppose C.S. Lewis would be appalled at this idea because he never had any problem with
Right.
drinking. So that's a good point that it is kind of an American thing.
Mhm.
But it does raise the question, the example of culture. How
Mhm.
does cultural shift influence things? And we very much live in a culture of foodies and connoisseurs of beer and whatever else, fine wine, the things that, like, what marks you as an educated, sophisticated person.
Mhm.
Um, and I think my point is, as Christians, we should not be that shallow in thinking of our identity in this world by those definitions.
It's good. I feel judged, not on the alcohol front, but on the coffee front. I now feel like you didn't specifically say it, but I feel a prick in my conscience. Just be like, it's not, being
Yeah.
the person who drinks bougie coffee is not an identity marker. It's not. And it's certainly not one that should be
I mean,
lauded. Yeah.
hello.
Listen, you all said there's only one perfect person.
Yes.
Um, okay.
Coffee is my sin too. So, yeah.
We'll work on it together. I mean, goodness, there's like a million things that I could say about this. At least one more I want to kind of ask about before I
Mhm,
ask you to think about kind of today, because I know that
mhm,
like book was published a few years ago, and if I know anything about books, it means that it was written at least a year before that. So obviously a lot has happened in the interim, but there was one thing that was kind of hanging out there that I rarely have a chance to talk about, um, and yet I often think about. I'm a father of a daughter, and I'm just also I live in the world, and so this is such a minefield. But I will nonetheless ask it. On page 103, you say the conversation today is more likely to focus on ways in which women's dress causes men to sin. There's a certain irony in this modern discourse that casts women as complicit in the sins of others, rather than viewing them, as the church fathers did, as spiritual equals of men, and thus while worthwhile members of of the local churches. Now, you also earlier on in the book talk about purity culture. And you talk about, and this is one thing that I noticed over the last couple of years, was just like, I mean, the amount of like blogs and books and podcasts that are just like, I kissed purity culture goodbye. And if anybody doesn't know what that is, you could easily look it up. But it was just this, I mean, the truth is that it's a kind of a negative handle placed on an emphasis in the late 90s, early 2000s about being just a renewed emphasis on people being sexually pure, whatever that might mean. And obviously it was received very negatively by a lot of people, and I think did some genuine damage to a lot of people. But you say that it seems like in our current culture, the Christian culture, we have thrown out the baby along with the bathwater of whatever that kind of purity culture movement was. And that's the thing I noticed. I kept hearing people say about how bad it was, how bad it was, how bad it was. And I understand that, especially if you're hurt by it. But then I was like, but what's left in the wake? Like, nobody was talking about any kind of a reconstructed version of what sexual culture should look like for Christians. So there is this idea, like, so much of, issue is women are blamed for the way that they dress, or they're blamed for the way that they act. That's terrible. And I wholeheartedly deny it. And yet here we are. Does that mean that we never consider how people are supposed to dress? Like, what is an actual, we hinted earlier, if there is supposed to be some kind of Christian ethic, how can women and men live together and talk about this stuff in an appropriate and healthy way?
Yeah, I think this is a legitimate question to consider. And it's funny how like we're throwing out the purity culture, but at the same time, our society is like completely overrun by pornography in the secular world. So clearly that's not going well either. Um, and the church really has a place for like speaking something healthy into it. And I think the church fathers, people like Tertullian, who a lot of times, like taken out of context, some of his comments are considered misogynistic. But instead, what we see is care. Just a question of how can the church care for you? And that's really like whenever the church fathers talk about women's dress, it's in the context of how can we love you?
Hmm.
And that's a wonderful question. Like whenever you want to judge someone, whenever you're dealing with a difficult situation of this sort, I think that's a great question to start with. How can we love you as a church?
That's good.
If you start from that point, I think the answers will be so much better than anything we've seen.
How can we love you as a church? That's good. How can we love you? Yeah, you mentioned the idea that Tertullian, Tertullian and Cyprian, each, they kind of sometimes have these statements that you're like, when you read them kind of baldly, you're like, ooh, that's pretty rough. You say here on page 101 that they reflect the church, however, self-staging as the parent of women converts, whether young or old, married or single, replacing traditional Roman guardianship with the fatherhood of the church. Yeah, it's funny. I'm doing a wedding this summer, and one thing that I've noticed over the last couple of years is that people don't, very rarely anymore, at least in my experience, this is very anecdotal, but they're not very often doing the who gives this man or who gives this woman to be married today. And I've had to point it out to a few people, but I think most people have just kind of found it on their own when they're like, oh, does this mean that I was like owned by my father before this happened? And it's such an odd thing that's kind of like this. It's like a bug that remained in the system all the way down to us. I don't know if you could literally trace it back to this idea of Roman kind of guardianship but you put out in the book that there was no such thing as a, for lack of a better word, independent woman. There was women who were under the guardianship of their fathers, under the guardianship of their husband, or maybe vestigial versions, or I'm maybe saying that wrong, but there might be some kind of like Christian ownership, not Christian, but like a religious ownership that could have been a possible, but either case. And so the idea is that the church was actually trying to be a place for them to have fulfillment, as, let's see, nobody being independent, I guess, is the bottom line. Not women or men being independent, but all of them being nested in the family of of the church. I thought that was a really helpful and beautiful way of viewing it, even though people would probably
Yeah.
balk against that in some respects today, I would guess
Well,
too.
and
But
we sometimes don't think about it because if we feel like we have strong networks and so on, we just sort of take it for granted. But the whole point is, in the Roman Empire, you had no safety networks.
Hmm.
If you were widowed, like there's a reason the New Testament talks about widows, care for widows so much, because if you have absolutely no one
Hmm.
caring for you, you literally could starve to death. And there was no safety network to save you.
Mhm.
And that's the point. The church cares for those that have no one else caring for them. That's beautiful. This is so like we think of ownership as this terrible thing, but the whole point is uh, we need other people.
Hmm.
And the church was meant to be that family for everyone,
Right.
for believers, caring for everybody in the community, not just believers, in fact.
Right. That's right. And you kind of go on to say, in some respects, that caring is maybe an answer to why the church ended up growing. Kind of even in the
Oh, yeah.
pre-Constantinian era. I can't remember the numbers. It was something like 10%. Oh, you might
Around the
even,
time of, yeah, by the
yeah,
time we get to Constantine, it's right around 10%.
which is bananas. Like that's a
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
significant portion of the Roman Empire that happened even before. And so it's just, I don't know
Well,
what the word would be,
that's
but
why
yeah,
Constantine felt comfortable saying like, okay, this is legal now.
sure.
Had it still been such a tiny, tiny, minuscule religion, I don't think he would have felt comfortable putting his neck out there like this.
Right. And you mentioned the work of Rodney Stark. I've never actually read any of his stuff, but I have read this other book. It's called "The Patient Ferment of the
Oh
Early
yeah.
Church." And it's
Hmm.
Alan Kreider. He cites
Yeah.
Stark's work a lot. It's just kind of this. It seems like it's for a long time been a bit of an enigma, maybe before Stark, about like how did this happen? And it seems like a lot of it is like, well, it's just
Hmm.
the faithfulness of Christians, being Christians,
Yeah.
just eventually made it interesting and alluring and appealing to other people.
Which is a good reminder that even if you are a cultural Christian, if you're failing regularly, you may still be doing some beautiful work out there that somebody else sees and says, "I want this."
Yeah, that's really good. Along those lines, then, so like I mentioned, this book I published a few years ago. I don't know if you've noticed some things have happened in the last few years. You live in a culture, I live in a culture. You already alluded to one of the things, like for example, the rise of, in Canada, we usually call it medical assistance in dying, MAID. What other kinds of things do you see now that you think these are some significant hot button issues for cultural Christianity that we need to kind of have our eyes open to?
One that we just kind of briefly mentioned is hyper-individualism, where
Mm.
we want to think of ourselves as like self-made persons that like nobody owns me. I'm my own person. It's like, well, that that's not how life works.
Uh-huh.
And whenever you have a crisis, you are uniquely poised to recognize that. But the other one that perhaps is related also is AI. So the whole question of artificial intelligence and how we think about it as church, like I'm seeing all those articles, like should pastors use AI to help in writing sermons? And my answer is usually like burn it with fire. But that's but all of these things are reminders of our identity. All of these things add up to identity questions like who
Hmm.
are we? Who owns us? And whenever we try to say nobody, I own myself, we are setting ourselves up as our own idols, and it never ends well.
Yeah. I haven't read the Alan Noble book, You Are Not Your
Mm.
Own, but I feel like I probably
Mhm.
should. I feel like that'd be good. Yeah, that's definitely a huge thing. So I would be remiss to not ask the obligatory question now about Christian nationalism,
Mm.
because I feel like, first of all, you actually talk about it in your book, and you say it's not a brand new thing. I tend to really appreciate when people contextualize their when they say Christian nationalism, what they mean, because like a lot of times people in the majority world are just referring to what's going on in America, but the truth is that it's happening in various places all over the world with various ethnicities, and it's been happening for how long now? A couple thousand years. So what what do you see? Is there anything even worth kind of like drawing us specifically from the history of how Christians, specifically in the Roman Empire, how they kind of interacted with government, how they kind of tried to pull on or resist the levers of power, politically speaking, and how that might kind of play into us today.
We have to keep in mind that by the time we get to Augustine and Rome is overrun by the Goths, um, Christianity has only ever existed in the context of the Roman Empire. So it's a major shock for Christians when the city of Rome is suddenly like conquered and sacked. It's horrible. And there's this sense of like, how could God betray us like this? And that's why Augustine writes The City of God, answering those questions and explaining like, well, the pagans who are saying that the pagan gods are punishing us are wrong, but also the Christians who are saying God is forsaking the Roman Empire are also wrong. So the whole idea of conflating God and country and saying like if our country is doing well, it's because God is on our side. Like that's not exactly like that's not exactly how it works. This leads us to faulty theology and really strange patriotism that is kind of iffy. So that's my concern with Christian nationalism, is that you're essentially saying that like love of God and love of country must go together. And maybe like in some way they do. I mean, it's a good thing to love your country, and it's obviously a wonderful thing to love God. But when you combine the two, sometimes things happen that really are not godly.
But we're only one person though, Nadya. That's the thing. So like, if we're supposed to love our country and we're supposed to love God, then how do we keep those things distinct? And I can't say the word Trump anymore. What's the thing that will bump the other one off if it becomes a problem? I don't even know if this is a question that you'd be comfortable asking again. We can kind of chop it if not, but just as we get ready to close here, I mean, you have citizenship in Israel. I mean, like, how do you see, I mean, I think it was just last night. I don't know. I don't go on X very often, but when I went on this morning, it was a wonderful host of threads where I believe it was Tucker Carlson who was interviewing Ted Cruz. And he was talking about the idea that Tucker Carlson, to my surprise, was basically asking Ted Cruz if he really considers the biblical mandate to support Israel, does he mean the government of the current nation state of Israel? And Ted Cruz said, of course, what else could it mean? And it was then just this various kind of like, such a polarizing thing where everyone was like, that guy's such an idiot. That guy's such an idiot. Like that they neither of them could see that there could be a question about this. I don't know if you have any thoughts, and I'd be happy to chop out this entire section. But I just don't understand people who believe that in some respects, the Israel that we're talking about in the Bible is the nation political state that currently exists there. And I don't know how that might even kind of connect to this idea of like why that's such a part of our culture these days.
I mean, that's again analogous to how Augustine rebukes both Roman pagans and Roman Christians for thinking that God had uniquely chosen the city of Rome as like this beacon of civilization to bring Christianity about. There are real people living in all of these countries that are currently bombing each other. And as Christians, I think this brings us back to the doctrine of the Imago Dei. Every single person is made in the image of the loving God who made him or her. So we're talking about real persons who are dying in this war. And every single one of those deaths is a tragedy.
So I appreciate you saying that. It's not a political football. It's real.
It is not political
football. Yeah.
It's real people. And as Christians, we should be grieved at any war that happens. I'm not an Anabaptist, but I will say that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I really appreciate you saying that. Thank you so much for sharing. I mean, goodness, this book has, like I said, it's just chunked with like, I mean, if I could show you the amount of things I underlined in the book, you'd be like, well, you should leave some space. So yeah, I'm going to come back to it time and time again in the future, and we'll look forward to seeing more of the work. You've got a Substack where you're kind of putting out some regular work. And like I said, you've got a book that just came out, one that's coming out. You can't be stopped. Is Substack the best place for people to kind of track with you, or are you on socials, other places too?
I think Substack is the best at this point.
Awesome. Dr. Williams, thank you so much for your voice and for all the effort that you've put into this. And I look forward to seeing what's next.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was a pleasure.
Hey.